Hi, everybody. This is Mohammed Ibrahim. I'm the Deputy Director with CARE Minnesota. And today we are so graciously joined with you all from Westminster Church. And today we are all excited to learn from Jaylani Hussein, who is the Executive Director of CARE Minnesota. And CAIR, C-A-I-R, stands for the Council on American-Islamic Relations. And this training is to teach us all about Islamophobia and the different challenges that the Muslim community faces from hate and from activities that produce hate. So today, Jaylani is gonna have a presentation for us, and we will allow for a period at the end to answer any questions that you all may have. And also, if you do have any questions of some sort, feel free to pop them right up in the chat. And I'd love to give the floor to Jaylani.
Thanks, Mohammed, and welcome everybody. It's great to have all of you, and for those who will be watching us later, I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'm going to go through a basic presentation about Islamophobia and to kind of cover what's going on, a little bit of what's happening here in Minnesota and across the country, and what at CARE Minnesota we do, and what faith communities like yourself can play a role in. And to make this lively, thank you for those who were able to join us today. I truly encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation if something comes up, or feel free at the end there to share your questions. So first and foremost, CARE Minnesota, as Mohammed mentioned, we are the organization that is tasked to address the issue of Islamophobia on many levels. And our organization has been kind of built around this creating and addressing this particular issue, creating solutions and addressing this issue in many ways. I'm proud of the staff here in Minnesota, and also the effort here, but also, as you will learn, sadly, Minnesota seems to be also sometimes an epicenter for national groups that are targeting Minnesotans because of the success that exists here in Minnesota when it comes to Muslims here. We are doing really good things that brings us a lot of attention and sometimes also expands on Islamophobia. So with that said, I will try to go for 30 minutes. Usually this presentation I go for an hour, a little bit longer, but I will try to run through. If at any point you feel like I went through too fast, that's fine. We'll share with you the slides if you like. I really am interested in getting into some of the questions that you have in discussion that we will get through. So with that said, let's get rolling here. So first of all, CARE Minnesota's mission has always been, and let me know if there's issues with the slides or you can't hear very well or whatever for those who are with us today. You can use the chat box, and feel free to also ask questions there if you don't feel comfortable asking it with your mic off. So CARE Minnesota, our mission has always been around this idea of dealing with education. You know, discrimination, particularly what we see in Islamophobia, a lot of it stems from ignorance. So if you look at this, you know, our mission, you know, to enhance the understanding of Islam and to build coalitions that promote, you know, justice and mutual understanding. So the word understanding is actually in there twice, and that's important. And then also the encouraging dialogue, which is a big part of the work that we do. Now, with that said, you know, CARE Minnesota, you know, one of the things that people always ask about Islamophobia is what is actually happening. And I wanted to show an example here before we get into dive into the details of two particular examples. One, on this day, September 18th of last year, so this is a year ago, you know, it's just an explanation of what type of things are happening. So on that week alone and that day, the businesses that were right across our building on East Franklin, we are actually, Care Minnesota is actually inside of a Bethany Lutheran Church. We occupy their office space for our office, and so the building that we're in is literally a block away from these businesses that are in East Franklin, and they were vandalized. About 7 to 8 of them were been vandalized by this person who really felt that Muslims were a target. Muslims hated Muslims, and so he was charged with hate crime. The day that this happened, we sent our staff to check because we didn't know all the facts as they were coming in. That same day, I was scheduled to speak in St. Cloud about hate and dismantling hate crimes. And there was a conversation between me and the ACLU and the police department there in St. Cloud, also the FBI, and also our commissioner for the Department of Human Rights. And as you can see on the right, that's the description of the event. And on the left is what actually happened. The St. Cloud hate crime panel was postponed due to safety concerns. And this is just, again, a way to ground us in the reality of what is actually happening, how all of this is manifesting itself in our reality, that, you know, talking about hate is also becoming a dangerous thing. In fact, the reason why the panel was postponed was really around the fact that the library where the event was being held, the police felt that there was enough threats against it that they didn't feel safe enough to protect it. I mean, this is the law enforcement who are saying this. And eventually, I actually still went up there and I still spoke at the library. Obviously, not as many people showed up, but there were counter protests there. And I even answered some of the questions of some of the folks who were there to disrupt and to even, you know, make wild allegations. And I wanted to start off by showing these 2 examples because things are happening. This is not an anomaly. We're not in a vacuum. Islamophobia is a real issue. It's impacting us in many ways. And now with you know, with COVID this year, we have seen an uptick. In fact, Mohammed and I, just before we got on this call with you or this presentation to you, we were talking about a mosque that has been vandalized in St. Paul multiple times that yet hasn't really organized around it. So it's just the nature of what's happening right now. And so let's get through what is actually Islamophobia. And this is another example that I show. And the reason why I show this example, and if some of you, the audio is not perfect here, I can just explain. There is subtitles here that will come up. But this happened in a Walmart in Minnesota. It's from 2015.
Jaylani, I don't think the audio is coming through.
So I will explain, and obviously that has subtitles. So thanks for letting me know, Muhammad. So one of the things that is important. Give me one second. Yeah, so sorry about that. So as you saw the video, the one thing that that is clearly evident here is that a couple of things that people always don't take into consideration. Number one, this incident was not the reason why this older woman working at Walmart was fired. This particular incident was never reported until much later, because the woman who actually recorded this found out that she lost the video. So then I think 2 years later, she found the video in the phone somehow. So then that she shared it with us, and then we went after, and then we found out that this employee actually had been terminated before. It shows that these types of incidents, first of all, happen. The second of all, the Somali women did not report it. They just let it go, which is another sign of a lot of these microaggressions and aggressions that happen, discrimination, go underreported. Your typical, person who would do something like this is someone who's at Walmart who's not working there, right? Right. But in this case, it's someone actually who's working there, right? And all that these women did was just be visibly Muslim, and that's another thing that I show this example because overwhelmingly we believe about 80% of all hate crime against Muslims are toward Muslim women, particularly Muslim women that are clearly identifiable wearing hijab or clearly wearing a Muslim garb. So that's one of the reasons why I share this particular video, because number one, the biggest misconception is that all the hate crime are being reported. It's not. Second of all, a lot of times bystanders are sometimes more critically important because victims of hate crimes oftentimes have a hard time reporting it or even seeing this as a problem. Maybe those women just see it as just a regular day. But most of you would be shocked, like, you don't talk to me like that. You first of all work here, you don't do this, you don't do that, right? And then also the fact that just because you're a Muslim woman, you're easily going to become a target of hate. Now let's go beyond that, and now I'm done with my little examples and go through a little bit. So CARE, we have chapters all over the country. We're a national organization, but each chapter is run independently and individually. CARE Minnesota was started in 2007. And our work really is around the work of providing civil rights. So we have 2 full-time attorneys that handle cases. We also do a great job of educating. And so this Islamophobia presentation is one of many presentations we offer to companies and organizations about diversity and inclusion. So our D&I space is critically important. In fact, we are perhaps I think we're one of the few organizations that does that very well. We won a national award for diversity and inclusion presentations. So we actually present to schools, churches, to Fox 9, local TV stations, and others around diversity and inclusion presentations and how to accommodate Muslims, presentations of Somali culture, among other things. And this is part of our effort to address and challenge Islamophobia. Does someone have a question? I saw someone unmute themselves. Yes.
Yeah, this is Barbara Guth. So when you talk about Islamophobia and you talk about Muslim, it's not Muslim phobia. Can you kind of explain what is Islam versus Muslim? I mean, exactly what those definitions are? Because I know there was a time where I would get confused about, I'm not really sure what it is that we're speaking about. So that's a really
good question. Thank you for asking that. So number one, Islam, that word is usually defines the theology. So Islam is the religion, and anyone who adheres to the Islamic principles or Islamic teachings, Islamic religion, would be a Muslim. So one is a religion, and the other one is the people. Now, with that said, we still have this issue of is Islamophobia the appropriate word to identify and explain anti-Muslim sentiment, right? Or anti-Muslim behavior, or and in fact, when we look at Islamophobia, we know it's also racialized. So a lot of times, those who hate Muslims really just hate anybody who looks brown. In fact, the number one, and you could write this in your chat box, the number one group of people who are not Muslim who are considered Muslim. Does anybody know? Does anybody want to throw a guess out there? They're not Muslim, but everybody thinks they're Muslim. In fact, they're the number one group of people to suffer hate crime as well. All right, I see some chats coming in. Yes, Matt is right. Sikhs. So Sikhs is absolutely true. They are the number one group, and particularly Sikh men, because they wear turbans, and so that gives people the perception that they're Muslim. In fact, after September 11, the first act of vigilantism against Muslims or hate crime was a killing of a Sikh man in Arizona, I believe, and it was a gas station attendant. So that's a really good question. I think when we talk about Islamophobia, what we're really talking about is a packaged hate against people who are perceived to be different, and obviously this religion who adhere to this religion of Islam. So a lot of times Muslim phobia is not used for the purpose that this is really around this idea that there's something inherently wrong with Islam is really where this mindset comes from. I personally I'm not a big fan of the word Islamophobia just because it might throw people off. For the purposes of what we're doing, it is good.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. We're in the age of COVID, so we don't know what is happening in our each other's homes. You know, you got to take a break and let the cat out or something. I don't know. I don't have a cat here, but anyways, thank you for your patience. So we'll keep going here. As you can see, Islamophobia, if you look at all of these aspects that drive Islamophobia, all of them are in here. So number one is ignorance and fear, as we talked about, the Islamophobia industry, and we'll talk a little bit about that. What does that mean? And one thing I think, especially for faith communities to be considerate of, is there are religious intolerance, and sometimes a lot of the hate is driven through religious intolerance. And then finally, organized hate, which can spew from Islamophobia industry. But that's the part I think that a lot of people in Minnesota, and many people, particularly most of you who may be watching, are just completely unfamiliar with, that this is not anomalies. These are not just things that's happening randomly. This is a well-organized machine, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. And finally, we see hate crimes, and hate crimes can appear at any time. Even though the cycle says all these things happen, the reality is that hate crimes can appear any time. So the first thing is ignorance, and I think most reports, most studies have shown that Americans continue to show a decline of favorable views toward Muslims. In fact, the first time ever Muslims were being surveyed was 2 years after September 11, and that is still the highest level of favorability toward Muslims of any survey done since then. So it's been declining, and in fact, there's been a sharp decline right at the election of President Obama. The election of President Obama in those 8 years created perhaps the highest exponential growth of hate because of this assumption that he was Muslim, and the fact that groups that felt that they were undermined or felt like the government did not reflect their values, and particularly the conservative groups utilized this particular strain as a focal point. So most of the hate movement and the targeting of Muslims really upticked during the 8 years of President Obama. It's hard to see it, but it was happening. Incidents kept happening and happening, and you see now with this administration the manifestation of some of that. Hollywood and media, and I particularly would say Hollywood and media are a critical point of how we perceive Muslims. We are right now finished up a survey, which you'll learn more about, where we did on the Star Tribune, and we looked at the Star Tribune for 20 years or 18 years. And we came up with almost 30,000 articles, and over 81% of those articles were negative. And then the 19% were really undefined. So think about this. In Minnesota, if you have been reading the Star Tribune from 2000 to 2018, and 81% of every article you've ever heard of about Muslims being mentioned is negative, how in God's, like, how can you have a positive view of Islam? Like, you know, if you're even not trying to have negative views, right? If the overwhelming thing that you read every single time is negative, the association of the word Islam and Muslims is always negative, right? You don't see every day in your local TV, by the way, Westminster member stole a cookie from SA, Super America. No one goes out and starts going after, right? In fact, that would be horrible, right? your congregation would be up in arms, first of all. Why did they report that? Right? But the reality is that's what's been happening, and that builds on our psyche. And when we talk about implicit bias and some of those things, that's a key grasper that exists. So in this particular study here that in front of you was on the New York Times, and it looked at multiple topics, and it looked at 25 years, and they found out about 57% of topics around or articles about Muslims were negative in the New York Times over that 25-year period. And comparatively to other topics, it was the highest. And if you look here, even cocaine was lower in negativity than Islam, right? And as you can see, even cancer and other things, right? And alcohol even, right? So, and then if you think about it right now, before the 2016 election, how many of you could even recall watching a movie where a Muslim character was, first of all, in there? And if the Muslim character was in there, who defined themselves as a Muslim identity, did they even do something that was positive, right? Most of them, if you remember Homeland, if you remember 24, there was always a ticking time bomb. In fact, I personally believe that the most sinister and the most dangerous form of education is usually through entertainment. And I think, you know, having, considering art or morally corrupt art as an excuse to project stereotypes over and over has negative consequences, as we all know. So this is the part where a lot of people just blame the news, but I think also we have to be conscious about how Hollywood does that as well. And when Muslims are on TV, guess what we are on? Guess what Muslims talk about? It's always terrorism. International terrorism leads when Muslims talk. So you're not going to see Jaylani talk about taxes or the Vikings or the Twins. Some bad thing happens in Twin Cities, involves Muslims, you're going to see a Muslim person being there. Now, I understand at that point it makes sense, but you just don't see Muslims being represented in other parts, other conversations. I mean, Minnesota, at least we have now Muslims in high-profile positions that are doing things that have nothing to do with their faith, but as a Muslim being visibly there, hopefully contradicts the stereotype that Muslims can only speak when there's a terrorism issue. I mentioned this a little earlier. So our legal department handles about nearly 300 to 400 cases a year. Most of those cases are employment-related discrimination. So we still have that in the state of Minnesota. And the pattern that we're seeing now is not blatant discrimination. It's almost middle management change. When there's a middle management or a plant manager changes, someone comes from another part of the country who's never really worked with Muslims, and all of a sudden says, oh, prayer? No, we're not going to let you do that. And completely violates people's rights. So, and usually we've been very good about addressing this issue through our diversity inclusion presentations, which really came out of a lot of the cases we handled with a lot of these employers. So a lot of employers really benefit, save time, energy, and increase employee morale, and create a better cohesion once they are able to understand, learn, and deal with the changes. Now I'm going to get a little nitty and gritty here with some of the Islamophobia stuff, and I apologize if I go a little fast. But so when we talk about religious intolerance in America, which is a big part of that cycle, if you look at particularly, and I just chose the three big groups here: Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. You look at anti-Semitism is still real today, still impact. We have rabbis saying that we have to have a security guard or armed guard in front of every synagogue in America. I mean, that's the kind of language that we're hearing today after what we've seen in Pittsburgh and in California and other places. But if you look at the history of intolerance in America, even with capitalism, you see they faced employment discrimination, denial of public accommodations, they faced race or organized discrimination, and they also faced laws that were being enacted. And what Muslims are facing today is exactly the same thing. Organized discrimination, laws like the Muslim ban, and laws like the Patriot Act that completely just target Muslims without really a good justification. Now, we've done CARE Minnesota is part of the CARE family. So if you go to Islamophobia.org, this is our website that has a lot of research documents. And each year we produce a document. And in 2019, the report that we issued looked at how money is being spent to drive hate. And in this report called Hijacked by Hate, we identify over 39 to 40 organizations and over, nearly about that have about a $1.5 billion that are actually using foundations, and they're using something called donor advised funding as a route to funnel money. Which means that it's one layer blind, so it's harder to know where that money is actually going. And this is something that is done for good reasons, but also, as you can see, being abused here. And so dark money is really driving a lot of the hate that we see today. And that's a big part of the reason why we see what we see today, and the polarization, but also the mobilization of hate networks across this country. And so this report goes over that and looks over that. As I mentioned, the industry, it's a well-funded industry. It's an industry that is out there right now growing. And now with social media actors have become now drivers of false information. If you, on this call today, some of you may remember there was a horrible incident at the Mall of America where a man who appeared to be mentally ill threw a toddler in the Mall of America. And immediately on social media, a couple of these big social media influencers used this to drive this narrative that a Somali man, a Muslim man, threw this baby. The reality was, first of all, the man was not Somali, but in fact, the guy who was mentally ill. But that story resonated all over. And in fact, these types of factoid stories continue to perpetuate the hate. You don't need a speech to tell you to hate Muslims. You use these stories to project this type of narrative. The one thing I showed this slide for is if you look at these two women here, one on the left and one on the right, they each have a book. Ayaan Hirsi Ali on the left, she's actually Somali. And then the woman on the right, Bridget Gabriel, which I believe is Lebanese. Both of these women are Islamophobes. Each of them speak to different crowds. So on the woman on the right there, she speaks to traditionally Fox News base, right? So conservative right. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali speaks to progressive left. And so usually when I'm talking to folks, I don't have a lot of opposition to Bridget Gabriel, but for Ayaan Hirsi Ali, most people have read that book, Infidel. And in fact, you know, whenever I'm in conversations with folks across the state, they're always like, I'm reading this wonderful book, Jaylani. And I'm like, wait for it, wait. And it's like Infidel. And I'm like, now I have to explain to this person that this woman is an Islamophobe. And she hides their Islamophobe through this intellectual, I'm a feminist, I'm exposing Islam and blah, blah, blah. She's first of all not a Muslim. Second of all, she's a liar. She lied in the Dutch and left the Dutch, and she has a history of lying. But most importantly, I think for the purpose of Islamophobia, she actually has been quoted to say that we need to get rid of Islam militarily, right? And that's not something many people hear about her, but that's what she does. And now she's no longer hiding. So in fact, Bridget Gabriel and Ayaan, they play in the same field. They show up on the same channels. In fact, Ayaan, I think now is no longer on the progressive left spaces like MSNBC. She's now a stamp in the Fox News of the world when it comes to these type of language. All right, so I'm gonna get a little faster because it looks like I'm at the pace of the hour. So this is the part that I wanted to explain. So in Minnesota, what's happening? First of all, we have to understand how dynamics of players play in. First of all, there's hate groups. We all know hate groups. And within hate groups, there are 3 layers. The one layer I'm not going to talk about is individuals, some random person out there who's going to act alone, right? But most people know 2 groups. One is a militia group. They're usually well armed. They're usually gun enthusiasts, former military, usually anti-government, yet they have since in 2008 focused on Muslims. The second group, which is overwhelming the majority, is groups that promote themselves as peace-loving, but really they're anti-immigration, anti-immigrants. They may be on the very conservative side usually, and they organize themselves to drive legislation and policies. And they're the ones that do a lot of the work. The militia groups are very deadly, less engaged publicly, but they are lethal if they act on their work. How do these groups, what are their intentions? So what we see, the other players are usually speakers who come to town, talk about Muslims. They want to expose Islam. And in Minnesota, we have become an epicenter sometimes for some of these speakers. So they've traveled everywhere in the state of Minnesota. In fact, I would consider that most of them have actually been to most of your rural towns, major rural towns that you know in Minnesota. They don't come to the Twin Cities because this is not an area where they have that sympathy, right? And sometimes they even run away because they think that they're going to be pushed back hard. So they go to rural communities. And then the last one is this legislation. They want legislation to ban Muslims, to stop refugee resettlement, to stop this or to stop that. That's their aim. That's their goal. So Ron Brunson is one of these speakers. He's from St. Cloud. and he's a car salesman, and he's now an expert on refugee resettlement. And he's been pitching this story for a long time now. Some of you know that Beltrami County, where President Trump was there in Bemidji just I think last week or a couple of weeks ago, became the first county in the country to accept the narrative that we need to end refugee resettlement and we need to stop, and counties need to make the determination on that. So that's what happened. A lot of people don't know that this work has been happening to lead to that point where this policy not only became a federal policy, but also even within the state, we see areas where these speakers and others have had a stronghold, had a huge impact in Minnesota. So he does that. He usually doesn't bash people, but he speaks about how immigrants are here to take over and the country's being forced on these immigrants. And for the record, Beltrami County or Bemidji County didn't have any refugee resettlement, and there was never intention to settle people there because really there's no jobs to the greatest extent. But the reality was that this was a ploy that became a narrative. And if you read the Bemidji Times, this guy and the guy next to him have been there. They've been there multiple times. In fact, this left article is from Bemidji, where Usama Duck says, Islam is a barbaric, savage cult, tells a crowd in Bemidji. So if you're wondering why President Trump went to Bemidji, well, the organizing that's happening there and these speakers have had a stronghold there. When I visited and I speak up in Bemidji at the university there and other places, I need security, which is just a reality of, because the school is going to get all these emails and threats, and all of a sudden we have to have security for me to speak up there. So just the reality. And this guy now, he travels everywhere, goes across the country. He's mainly damaging, very, very dangerous, especially on Christian radio stations in northern Minnesota. If you go to northern Minnesota and you just keep turning that dial on the radio, you're probably going to hear this guy before you head back down to Minneapolis. And he goes out there and talks about how Muslims are going to come and kill you, and killing you is a small matter to them, and et cetera, et cetera. And for him, this is a business, right? These people are trying to make money, and selling books and selling this and selling that. All right, so he was there in Wilmer recently, and I share this slide for two reasons. One, we've learned at CARE Minnesota strategies that help communities deal with speakers like this. We have learned over the last 5 to 7 years what is the best strategy. And in this strategy in Wilmer is actually what we don't recommend, but it was the first time Wilmer had something like this, so they actually jumped the gun. And I'll share with you the strategy. So the first thing that happened is that the Wilmer local paper wrote 2 articles. The first article was a month in advance of the event. And that's the article we usually recommend for community members to push back against, because they actually try to bait you into this conversation to prop up this huge event. So they used to do that before, and we used to challenge them. But then recently we learned that we're like, nope, if we're not going to comment on this article, you shouldn't write about this. When the event happens, feel free to write about the event. But in a small town, if you write up a controversy story, some person is coming, some people are against it, there are more likely people to show up. It becomes a huge story, and that's how they benefit and organize their hate movement in those local towns. So we actually recommend, we have strategies that we recommend to avoid that type of rise. And then you have a huge clash of people showing up. And then also this idea that people, when they push back, they feel like they did something, which then takes away the opportunity to really organize and go in deep and to educate the community as well. So I'm going to go through the next slides a little faster, and I apologize, I keep saying that, but I'm going to go a little faster. So when we talk about national level, groups that have been pushing anti-Muslim hate are usually the ones crafting the messaging. Then they pass it down to these small groups all over the country. So these groups grab these talking points, and then they run down to state legislator, and they try to push those bills. And usually they have what I call starter states, or states that they like to run with. So Idaho and Montana, sadly, are the states that usually pass some sort of anti-Muslim bill. Then, you come to your local state representative here in Minnesota, and you're like, listen, the Muslims are here, we got to do this. They usually never use the word Muslims, but we got to do this, we got to do that. And by the way, it passed in Idaho. And the poor state representative or senator is like, okay, sure. Some are starting to get a little smarter and figuring out that, but the reality is that that's how sometimes state legislation gets pushed. And this is an example of the people who push it and what they believe, right? And the reality that's on the ground. So hate groups exist. The Southern Poverty Law Center has maps of some hate groups. What I consider is these are traditionally old hate groups. What do I mean by that? These are groups that are usually easily identifiable online, easy. So for example, like if you have a group called Aryan Strike Force, or You Can Run But You Cannot Hide. You know, these are actually two Minnesota groups. Like, you're telling everybody you hate people. The groups that we're seeing now in the state of Minnesota are groups that are typically unincorporated, meaning that there's no incorporation somewhere. Minimal online presence, so you're not going to see a Facebook page. If there is, it might be closed. Deceptive names. So there was a group called Wilmer First, which Ron Branson, as I mentioned to you, the guy who travels around and gives presentations, tried to help start. Now in Wilmer, there's a group called V Word with THEE, something like that. And then there's Friends of. So how many of you on this chat right now know a group known Friends of Smith Park? Does anybody know Friends of Smith Park in this? If you do know, just type it. If you don't, I'm assuming most people don't. If you don't, Friends of Smith Park is a group that actually targets the Bloomington Mosque that was bombed in Minnesota. And Smith Park is the park adjacent to the mosque. And really, it's not a group, it's just a couple of people, but they sell themselves as a group. This group has been targeting this mosque for nearly since the inception of this mosque. And they have their blog or their writing got picked up by the national hate groups, the Pamela Gallagher that I showed you earlier, Bridget Gabriel and Pamela Gallagher, the other groups that are leading some of these hate groups across the country. Once it got picked up, it became knowledge, information about this mosque. And we believe that is how the 3% militia group, as I mentioned, hate groups, right? And then the militia group from Illinois drove 600 miles nearly, avoided tollways, avoided cameras to come and attack the Bloomington Mosque, right? And so militia groups and other these groups reinform each other. So even if this little mom and pop hate group in your neighborhood seems to be very innocent and they care about the noise, they care about the ordinance violations, what they're doing is feeding information to hate groups and individuals out there who may attack now this mosque or this group or this individual. And also Coalition for a Peaceful Something. And there's a bunch of those out there. So deceptive names that sometimes people don't know very well who they are. So I'm not going to show the length of this video, but this video is an explanation of what militia groups are doing. So this is the 3% militia group in North Dakota. And in 2016, they put up a video where they actually take a makeshift mosque. They take a little wooden mosque that they make of themselves. They put TNT inside of it, and then they take AR-15s and shoot at it. And then they record the video and put it up on YouTube, which is to tell people we're going to shoot up a mosque kind of thing, right? So they were not, you know, they're like, our target practice now is this little mosque that has some sort of TNT inside of it. So here's the mosque, as you can kind of see a little bit, and then they shoot up these high rifle weapons at it, and it literally just explodes, as you can see. So they were, and they have other videos where they're doing tactical stuff, and we believe that they're trying to organize some sort of an attack of a center or a mosque. So militia groups are deadly, right? They're not gonna put out a little flyer. They're not gonna bring in a speaker from out of town. They're not gonna, they're not gonna do these other things. They're not gonna try to convince you. They're not gonna show up and try to intimidate Jaylani or whatever at an event and call the president of that university. You're right. They're going to plan a sophisticated plan and come in the middle of the night and bomb a mosque. That's what they're going to do, right? Or something worse, God forbid. Now, hate groups, the other hate groups that I mentioned also target any groups that are pushed back against this hate. So Catholic Charities in St. Cloud, for example, was doing refugee resettlement. And because Ron Branson and others were pushing this message that refugee resettlement is bad, refugee resettlement is this issue, they're pushing that. They kept targeting, and they actually put up this billboard, and I think on Highway 10, eventually got taken down, but it was targeting Catholic Charities for resettling refugee resettlement. Catholic Charities had to say now in St. Cloud doesn't resettle refugees anymore. Obviously, I think it's because of the refugee ban, But also, I think they really took a hit and probably lost a lot of donors, among other things. So they were pressured, regardless of their decision to close. So what's the group of hate groups? Number one is to frame Americans Muslims to be dangerous. That is the ultimate goal. They want to project this idea Muslims are dangerous, Muslims are dangerous. And I want to be very particular about this because this is perhaps the one thing that is on both sides of the political spectrum. So Islamophobia is on both sides of the political spectrum. It's not just a conservative right issue, on the left side too. This idea we have to protect ourselves. And you saw both candidates, Trump and Hillary Clinton in 2016, mentioned the same thing, just in different ways. Everybody know what Trump said, but Hillary said things like, we got to be really nice to Muslims. We got to work with Muslims because they know who the terrorists are, or they will help us. And this type of language runs the slippery slope of Islamophobia and tropes, because then it self-identifies that Muslims are part of the problem. And so therefore, if we don't engage them, they won't tell us who the terrorists are, right? And that just really is problematic, because none of us wake up every day, Muhammad and I, and we're like, hey, start talking to our neighbors like, Muhammad or Ali, don't do anything stupid today. You know what I mean? It just doesn't work that way, right? We don't go around and police each other. We're not the police, right? In fact, majority of plots foiled have actually been by Muslims. If they hear something, they tell. I mean, that's just the nature of it. In fact, we get double punished whenever there's a terrorist attack, right? We get scapegoated. We have to condemn it. We have to. So it's a burden on us. We know, right? There's enough burden on us. But then when you then project this idea that we are somehow a community that needs to be engaged for the purpose of identifying, this also projects overwhelming threat to something that is not the overwhelming threat. Right now, 97% of all terrorist attacks that happen in the United States domestically have been by white supremacists. Yet there's overwhelming focus on those who have Muslim names or consider themselves Muslims. All right, so this is another example of groups that continue to talk about this idea of overtaking America. Muslims are here to take over America. And the reality is all of these types of tactics were tactics used against the Catholic community, against the Jewish community, against other minority religious groups in America, right? Catholics were apparently supposed to take over. John F. Kennedy was supposed to take over America and make the Pope the president, right? That was a reality in the 1960s, that Catholics were here to take over America, right? This idea. In fact, you know, I was talking to a professor who said he always asks his class at the beginning of the class, what's the percentage of Muslims in America? And people always come up with wild numbers, 20%, 15%, 30%. Then he tells them the truth, which is, you know, 1% probably. And people are like, not worried about the issues that they thought they were worried about. They thought Muslim takeover and all of these things, right? And so a lot of this fear is based on that same old fear that exists. Here's another example of some of the hate crimes, and I'll go through these real quick. You know, man delivers DoorDash food, and he delivers to this wealthy home, and the guy literally just starts assaulting him, and then thinks that somehow he can just get away with it. Thank God for the neighbor that came back to his aid. And the interesting thing about this story is that because it happened in Minnetonka, the police chief there wrote a press release, and in the press release, the police chief acknowledged not the victim statement, but acknowledged the man who assaulted the victim, his statement. So it just shows you the kind of nature. Even when victims tell their story, you have law enforcement that want to dismiss the actual hate. Like, no, it didn't happen that way, you know. So in this story, the police department shared that, oh, he put the food in the wrong place. Regardless of if you put the food in the wrong place, no one should be physically assaulted and choked and told to go back to their country. That part, the police chief didn't mention in his press release. And I know, by the way, this is a classic example. Whenever hate crimes happen in rural communities, and particularly in wealthy communities, there seems to be a runaway from the problem, and seem like this shouldn't happen here. Like, this is our cute neighborhood and shouldn't happen. A few months back, in the early summer, right after George Floyd was killed, the same guy who did the umbrella, who burnt down, I think, the auto place, was the same guy going into Stillwater harassing a Muslim family. And the police had to be called 3-4 times because, you know, usually hate crime issues doesn't resolve in the top tier of our response. So the police had to be called multiple times. And again, Stillwater is a beautiful community. You know, all of us had to get out there for, you know, a summer walk or whatever, right? But we don't expect this type of thing to happen in Stillwater either. All right, so this also happened recently in Starbucks. Barista writes ISIS, and this is a teenager who works there. And the thing about it is that our Muslim kids have been called ISIS. They've been called terrorists, right? And so this is a well-documented information. And the young woman was called Aisha. And the interesting thing is that the moment the Aisha said, "I need to speak to your manager," that's immediately when the young woman recognized, oh, ISIS is wrong. Right? Before that, it was like, what's wrong with the cup, right? And it's like, what is this? Why would you put ISIS on there? And so it's just the nature of what's happening. And sadly to say, the Target's response was that, oh, she's young and she didn't know. We've had young men join terrorist organizations in the state of Minnesota. We've had stories upon stories written in every paper, and it was, since it was involved with young people, I'm almost 100% guaranteed that most teenagers in the Twin Cities, if they know anything about young Muslims, they usually associate them with some form of terrorism. Sad to say, but this is the unfortunate reality. And when you have a young barista do that as a way to try to, like, you know, I think she was trying to do it, you know, intentionally. Sadly to say, even the response was horrible. All right, so and bullying happens to the point, I'm just gonna go through this. We had one of the worst incidents that happened 2 years ago, where a young Muslim kid, Jacob, sadly committed suicide after 3 years of literally being beaten by other students, not believed by teachers, and it got to the point where he committed suicide. And it's sadly to say, he committed suicide 2 weeks after there was something called the Punish a Muslim Day. And it was a global thing that was going on, a global virtual thing where people put out Punish a Muslim Day. And if you do this, you get 5 points, or if you do that. And sadly to say, all of this punishment, all of this bullying, where he got his collarbone broken, head concussion, hair pulled out, called terrorist every day almost, and teachers just literally ignored it. And he was the only Muslim kid in his entire school, and he's white. Obviously, his parents, you know, one of his parents is Arab, but the other one is white, his mom. And all of this started when his mother started to wear the hijab, the head covering. In fact, he got to a point where he kept telling his mom to take it off for her safety, right? Because he felt like that the threat that was happening to him at school would be happening to his mom as well. Sad story. And mosques are being vandalized left and right. As I mentioned, this is just something that we're starting to see happen a lot more. Oops. You can see someone here. And then when that incident happened, so this is the interesting thing. Even when bad things happen, online, a lot of the negative thing gets spinned. So this is a point where I like to mention quickly, is that a lot of the times when you hear bad things happen or good things happening, it's always important to reshare the information. Even if something bad happened and you feel bad about it, reshare with community. Did you hear that this mosque got vandalized? Because the opposite group, the group that are promoting lies and fake, and they get excited. They'll spin anything. Like this story, they're like, look, did they smash their own windows? The same thing they did in the Bloomington Mosque, which actually President Trump's staffers in the White House said it was an inside job when the bombing happened, right? Eventually, when the white supremacists were caught by the FBI and others, they still didn't mention the fact that these white supremacist militias bombed. So this is something about also an important part of mentioning. So I'm gonna pass this part. I think the myths I've kind of mentioned a little bit. To respond with hate, you really don't need to be an expert of Islam. You just need to recognize that what hate is. And I think most importantly, Islamophobia is not a conservative issue. It's on both sides of the political spectrum. Hate is not driven by just ignorance. It's driven by knowledge. It's driven by money. And not only in the US, it's a well established. These are the 4 traps that they usually Islamophobes will put out there. the idea that terrorism is a big issue. Well, what about terrorism, right? And Sharia law, they're here to take over America. They have a secret plan. Muslim women are subjected under horrible rules in Muslim majority countries until the Me Too movement happened in America, where finally America woke up a little bit about bad things happening to women in America as well, right? And then this idea of the misquoting the Quran. So number one, terrorism is just one of these things, right? After September 11, this idea that terrorism is only from the Muslim community. The reality is 99% of the victims are Muslim of global terrorism, right? The people who are fighting terrorism are Muslim. And most people don't know that. They just know, when there is a non-Muslim killed, right? But there's majority of the people who are killed all over the world today are Muslim. So in fact, if you understood that fact, then you'd be more sympathetic to Muslims. Every time a terrorist attack happens, you'd be trying to console a Muslim family who probably they had loved one, extended loved one killed. Sharia law, this story of America, right? That John F. Kennedy, the Catholics, they were here to take over. That same narrative is coming back here as well. And then Muslim women, right? Muslim women are subjugated. And the reality is, yeah, in the Muslim majority countries, there is issues that exist with women's rights. But in majority, women actually in Muslim countries do okay, and there is nothing in the religious text that promote this type of unfair treatment of Muslim women. In fact, if you look at many of the Muslim countries, they've had Muslim women presidents, right? We can't say that for the United States. We might have a VP this year, but right. So you get the idea that Muslim women somehow don't have that luxury. And then the Quran, you misquote the Quran, there's always something about the Quran, right? And it's usually ... something and then ... And you can't do that, right? You could do the same thing to the Bible. You could do ... and misquote the Bible, right? And most of you in this congregation would know that, right? That would be an unfair, right? So that's the most, and then I'll end with what can you do? Number one, I always tell folks in activism, those who want to challenge hate, those who want to get around, match your passion with your activism. Find out what you love to do, whether it's reading, writing, I don't know what it is. I always use this weird example. If you go to the YMCA and work out, or you're a workout person, and I used to work at the YMCA, by the way. I know there's some people who just show up to lift weights. They're there for 2.5 hours. They're barely lifting any weights because they're just there to socialize with other people, right? So whatever is your happy place, whatever you feel good, mash that with your passion for activism. That could be the place where you can talk about some of the things that matter to you. If you're a knitter, if you have a Facebook group or whatever it is, because once you match your activism with your passion, the likelihood of you doing it frequently more is better. The second thing is we got to become better listeners. And I really hate to say this, but especially now in a month before the election, we have become more and more increasingly people who don't listen to each other. And when I say that, I have to conceptualize it by saying, I don't want you to listen to the loudmouth uncle in your family who nobody wants to listen to. That's not the person I'm asking you to listen to. The intolerable person. I'm talking the head nodders, the silent people in the corner. They are the 98, 99% of the majority of the people who agree with bad information, right? But no one wants to talk to them, right? Everybody's activism is always against the one person you should not have any activism against, the loudmouth, the person with the preach, the guy who's protesting across forget those people. Talk to the majority of the people who are head nodding. And one thing I always mention about listening is that, most people in America, and most of us, we mask our hate with a true pain. So there is something true that exists. Every time somebody, you trivialize their statement, you might be touching on a true pain. They lost a job, they lost a family member, they're dealing with a real issue. And that issue is bothering them, but they're masking it with this other thing. It's these Somalis. It's really not the Somalis. It's just because you lost a job, or your business is failing, or your son is not doing in school. Something is bothering you, but now you want to blame these other people, right? We do that all the time, and this is the same thing. So listening to what's not being said is critically important. And I guarantee you, if you sit there, listening itself is a therapy. If the person who has a different view from you sees that you're willing to listen and not be judgmental and not to respond right away with a counterpro, the likelihood of them listening to you is much higher. And in fact, when most people get off their soapbox, they're willing to add more to their soapbox. Just like children, when a child wants to tell you what they saw outside and you're trying to tell them to wash their hands, it doesn't work. You got to let them finish what they got to say, then tell them to wash their hands, because the reality is they want to tell you everything that they just saw, right? So this is an important part of activism, to become better listeners. And trust me, you've never been coached or taught how to listen well. You know, we've always had the aha, nod your head. All of those things doesn't mean about listening. In fact, there's a wonderful book that Leslie Crutchfield wrote about our art of conversation. And one of the things that she talks about is this idea of listening. Everything we've learned about listening is wrong. Be empathetic listener, and learn that this person you're talking to or is talking to you may have a different learned experience. Now, last part is speak up. Now, the one thing about speaking up is everybody thinks they speak up. You don't. You really don't. Sad to say, a wake-up call to tell you, you don't speak enough. Most people in our communities today, in activism, we just show up and speak up, sadly, when something happens. So we're reacting to something. The reality is, most of the hate that is pushed on social media today, it's people who are speaking up all the time. Just go on any of our local news stations and just go to the social media posts and just see how many people are willing to share some of the worst things that they want to say about other people, right? The rest of the people, we do the type, delete, type, delete, and then just let it go. We do that because we're afraid to put ourselves out there. We got to become more proactive speaking. We got to utilize our voice in different ways. We got to speak up at times when people are willing to also listen. So if it's July 4th, say something about the things that matter to you, and combine it with July 4th. If it's Christmas, the same thing. Tell people about Christmas and what it means to you, but also talk about some of the issues that are important to you and what you want to see. And people will listen, right? Be proactive about your activism. Don't wait for some mosque to be bombed for you feel bad and send some money and say bad things are supposed to happen to Muslims, right? In fact, you can strike more conversations if you engage in these conversations and learn more. And then with interfaith, I always encourage that interfaith 2.0 or activism, proactive. You know, we need interfaith to be out there. We need churches to be outside into the community, out there on the streets marching and protesting. We need people to talk to folks at the VFW, right? To talk to folks at the bars, to talk to folks in the streets, right? Because the walls are safe spaces and sanctuary, but the reality is we are losing our people. We're being more polarized on the streets, in these hallways, in these communities, in these spaces, not in our churches, right? And not in our mosques and synagogues. So the days when interfaith work was focused on how do we learn from each other, now we got to hold hands, and just like in the 60s, be out visibly, in modeling good behavior, but also at the same time healing people, reaching out to people, using the teachings of our religions to be, moral lights into this society, and providing that. So, and if everything fails, we do have a drug. It's called Islamophobia. You take two, and it's a joke. It's just a gum, but I always like to end with a little bit of humor. All right, and I'll end with this statement that Dr. King always adds, which is, in the end, we will not remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. So we have to be proactive. And I apologize, I went beyond my 30 minutes because I felt like if I have to give you the full details rather than try to stop it. So I'm open to, if you have the time to hang around for another 15 minutes to do Q&A and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing with us. It's really, I learned a lot. I hope everyone else did as well. I am curious about, do you have examples of churches that are doing well, local churches that have been out there proactively, as you mentioned, and have had effective countermeasures to Islamophobia in their community?
That's a really good question. So, sadly to say, most of the work that I have seen has actually happened in rural Minnesota. Because the reality is the tension is much higher. So when we talk about hate in Minnesota, it's in places where Muslims don't even exist. So it's in, Bagley, Minnesota. I don't even know if there's a Muslim there in Bagley, right? It's in places that usually are susceptible to anti-Muslim rhetoric, because this fear that it's building up, but they really never interacted. I would say in those spaces I've seen a lot, particularly in the Unitarian churches, who are really have taken on social justice as a pedestal. A lot of the rural churches sometimes kind of are trying to walk a tight line because they're smaller communities and rumor mill and all of that. And also our organization, Care Minnesota, has so much baggage, right? We are on the front line, so everybody hates us, right? We're the organization that is, putting the boots on the ground, and people see us as the this huge enemy. So we draw a lot of attention. But I would say in the Twin Cities, there are a lot of congregations that have taken on what I consider to be more symbolic roles, whether they are learning from Islam, whether they are putting on their moniker, for example, Blessed Ramadan, or putting those wall signs out there in Ramadan. Some of these things are good. I actually think where I would like to see more, and some of that has happened also in the Twin Cities, is if you have a Wednesday group or you have a social justice group, to actually learn some of the strategies that we've been talking about, because this presentation I gave you is kind of like what's going on, but we actually have some strategies and some things that we offer for those who want to dive in a little deeper, and then go out there and actually run activities and actually teach your own congregation about Islamophobia, and continue to do that. And then one thing we also recommend is if you have connections to rural Minnesota, wherever you have a cabin up there, whether you have a neighborhood or community you've come from, these are places where you can go back and have conversations with folks about what's happening, because they're always like, something bad is happening in the cities, and those people in the
I think Jaylani froze. We'll give him a couple seconds here to come back. There he is.
What you're really addressing is the hate movement in our communities, and it's critical that we take a strong approach from that. The last part or the churches that I've seen a little bit is, the least you could do is invite us like you did today, and invite us and have people speak and continue to hear what we're saying. And I inspire hopefully some of your congregations, if they're interested in helping out, being part as volunteers for our organization, because you got to insert yourself in the work, right? You gotta learn about what's happening. You got to show up to some of these events. You gotta, I wish some of you came along with the events that I go to, and your eyes would open up. Like I remember in St. Cloud, we had this event where we were talking about the similarities between what's happening to Muslims today and the potential of being what we had in the Japanese American, incarceration. And we had a survivor who was speaking on a panel in St. Cloud with me, and a woman stood up in the middle of the panel, and she said to this survivor of the Japanese internment camps, said, "I am deeply sorry that this happened to you. Our country did the worst thing." And then she turned around and looked at me and said, "You're a terrorist, though." And the Japanese American survivor could not believe it. They're like, "Oh my God!" Like the whole purpose of my entire time of speaking as a survivor, not to repeat this woman could not even understand, as she apologized to me by calling this community leader as a terrorist. She couldn't get it. And for them, it was even an awakening point. Like they're like, "We didn't know." And it also drew upon for them a great deal of anxiety and stress from just thinking that actually that type of framing, that type of thinking is alive and well.
I have a quick question about language. You talked a little bit about the importance of speaking up, and I certainly agree with your comment of the head nodders are the quiet people in the room who aren't really venturing out, but who may be agreeing with some of what they're hearing. I guess my question is one of what could be some helpful language for us? You acknowledged that there has been a history of some young men signing up for terrorist organizations from the Twin Cities. Yet somebody could say, "Oh, Christians," in our own context, they're like this. They have, they're polygamists and they live in their own little isolated communities. And you'd say, "Oh, that was a small, the Latter-day Saints, they outlawed that over 100 years ago." We can deal with that because we realize that Christianity is much more segmented in some groups that are more conservative, some groups are more liberal. If somebody says, yes, there are bad Christians out there, there are bad Jews, there are bad Christians, there are bad Muslims who seek to do evil in the world, but that's not everybody. And those of us around us, those of us in the community in the United States, they tend to be more liberal, they tend to be more progressive, they tend to, what's kind of the language we can use to separate what somebody sees as one person far away, that a little clip they see on Fox News, versus the woman we might encounter in a store in our everyday life?
Unmute myself. Brent, I think that's a really wonderful question, and thank you for both you and Sarah for joining us. I think that's so there's two levels to that conversation. First, there's word that I recommend when it comes to taking space back. I mean, if you're in a deep conversation, somebody's opening up and you're having a dialogue, I think you'd have the more intellectual conversation. But there are some power into being the adult in the room to some extent, because the people are praying, they're pulling for information, and they want to see in the room if it's acceptable for me to continue this type of language. And so one of them is actually just knock it off. So, and you don't have to like explain yourself. You can just keep repeating that word, hey, knock it off. Or you could do the character involvement, because a lot of times people like to talk about hate or project hate or have a discussion about hate or race and subject it outside of themselves. Like it's an intellectual debate happening in front of me, so I can keep picking and saying what I want, right? But the moment you say, Bill or John, I didn't think you were like that, or I didn't believe you believe these kind of things. Now you're saying you are the one attached to what you just said, right? That's another part of communication that's critical. As far as this intellectual debate about, this person now wants to know, has bad things happened? Of course, right? And usually the one thing that I always recommend is that what has been your experience like, right? And then the one thing that I would go back to is the reality is that in every community there are those who are extreme. Extremism existed all the time. Extremism exists today in different things, right? The question is, how do we generalize the conversation? Muslims don't deny that there are Muslims out there killing people. In fact, our religion teaches us to fight extremism. In fact, some of the worst and harshest commands to fight are to fight against religious extremism. Of all the extremism, the one thing that Islam is taught to fight, or Muslims are taught to fight, is the religious extremism, because they're dangerous. They're equating religiosity to greatness. In fact, one of the theological teachings is that the Prophet said that they will actually pray better than you. They may fast better than you, but their entire faith is as thin as a paper, like a very thin paper, meaning that they don't understand the religion, right? It's a sheer appearance. That's why Osama bin Laden, who was an engineer, never went to study the Islamic studies, never held an Islamic position in any mosque or any religious institution, right? He was just an engineer, snobby engineer from a family who wanted to have an experience. But then when he became this terrorist, what did he do? He dressed up like this scholar who had years of experience, came from a multi-university, and he put on the head thing and wore the robe, right? And that's because the appearance, right? And it's a very dangerous thing. So I think the reality is that, like the points that I mentioned, when the terrorism thing comes up, to say, did you know that 99 or 97% of all victims of global terrorism are Muslim? All of a sudden now you switch the conversation back from Muslims are terrorists to Muslims are victims, right? We don't hear, when a bombing happened in Kabul, what do we hear? Today, 75 people died in Kabul. If MSNBC went on and showed us the 75 people, put their names on there, tell us what they do, how many children they have, how many goats they had, how many, whatever, we would all of a sudden sympathize with these victims. We never hear these victims. We just hear a blanket number, 5 people killed in Mogadishu. In fact, in Minneapolis, when my family is pained is when there's a bombing that happens somewhere in Mogadishu. One of my relatives was literally 5 minutes away, could have been caught in a bombing that happened last year. And I was on the other line when my wife was talking to her, and she's rattling off how she was close to being killed today, right? That's the kind of conversation people are not hearing. And then all of a sudden now they can come back. And then I think, as you said, it's always important to not subjugate a point to somebody and say, this is my experience. My experience is what I've learned. I've learned this. I've realized this, or I studied this, or I saw this in the news. That way gets you away from trying to influence this person and say, no, Jim, you shouldn't think like this. You should think like me, right? Let's run away from that and say, you know, that's my experience. My experience is I found out the majority of Muslims who are killed today are by terrorists, right? And majority of Muslims in America are patriotic. In fact, and this is a point I didn't mention here when he talks about Sharia, the Islamic Sharia, which is Islamic way of life. It's not the penal code system. The Islamic way of life actually commands Muslims, when they are the minority like we are in the United States, to actually follow the laws of the land. So our Sharia is the United States Constitution. That's what God is telling us to do, right? But even that conversation may be better suited after you've opened up and had a longer conversation, rather than trying to have this debate with someone who says, well, they're here to take over. You know, maybe the best response could be knock it off. And then maybe if the conversation went beyond, you can have that. And one thing I will end with by saying is saying that I've learned and picked up from somewhere. I don't know, somebody said it somewhere a long time ago, I think. What's not reasoned in can be reasoned out. So if this person took information in unreasonably, trying to reason with them may not be the right thing. And that's where I talk about this idea of pain. Pain is a powerful thing that if it's attached to a segment or some idea, it's hard to pull it off. And that's why listening to people and trying to uncover that may be helpful, and sharing wonderful things. Really good question. Thank you.
Do we have anybody? I can't see several of the participants' videos. Is there any other questions before we end tonight? I don't hear any. I'm so glad that you were here with us tonight.
Good, huh? That's good.
You answered them all. Yeah, that's right. Thanks for taking the time to be with us and share your experience and knowledge. And we're really, I hope that we will stay in touch and continue this conversation into the future. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. And I just want to say I love Westminster, particularly the wonderful speakers you bring in and the beautiful sanctuary. I've been there for multiple events, and it's a really beautiful community, and I really appreciate you having me and having us to be part of your teachings, and I really look forward to connecting with you further on. And I know you also do wonderful things. I think there's an autism center there. There's wonderful things you're all doing. So we really appreciate all of that and the many things that your community involves in. So hats off to you, and we're fans of the work that you do. So we hope to continue to work with you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and everybody that joined us. Thank you so much for taking some time tonight.